chest. A Syrian, despised by all. A slave to my husband Batiatus.
A man who should be dead is standing inside the house that once treated him as property. That is the first thing I cannot get away from with Spartacus How Ashur. Not the arena, not the swords, not the Roman spectacle, not even the return to a world that for years seemed completely finished. It is that single contradiction. Ashur survives, and somehow the man who once fought, schemed, crawled, bargained, and bled his way through somebody else's system now owns the very gladiator school that once owned him. And immediately the whole meaning of the house changes, because a ludus is never just a building in Spartacus. It is a machine, a place that turns human beings into property, pain into entertainment, loyalty into currency, and ambition into something that can either save you or destroy you. So when Ashur steps into that machine from the other side, the question is not simply whether he can run it. The more interesting question is what happens when somebody shaped by a brutal system finally gains control of that system. Does he break it? Does he improve it? Or does he become the clearest expression of it? That is the compartment I want to open with you. Welcome to the film box, where we do not stop at what happened. We look at why it happened, how the pieces connect, what the filmmakers are quietly building beneath the spectacle, and why certain choices stay in your head long after the dust settles. Every film is a box. We open it together. And yes, this time we are opening a television series rather than a feature film. But the method is exactly the same. Find the clue, follow the mechanism, connect the evidence, and see what the story eventually reveals. Spartacus, House of Ashur, gives us a perfect clue before the story even gets moving. Ownership. Who owns the house? Who owns the fighters? Who owns a reputation? Who owns the truth about the past? And maybe most importantly, when a man has spent years being controlled by stronger people, what does he do when control finally becomes his? That is why bringing Ashur back is more interesting than a simple character return. On paper, the idea almost sounds like a provocation. The original story gave him an ending. House of Ashur deliberately bends that history and asks us to imagine another path, one where the Romans reward his betrayal with the gladiator school once associated with Batiatus. Suddenly, a character who spends so much time surviving other people's games becomes a person expected to set the rules. But power is not the same thing as freedom. That distinction is going to matter. Because Ashur has always been fascinating for one reason: he understands weakness. He notices where people are insecure. He sees what they want. He studies the room, finds the pressure point, and survives by making himself useful at exactly the right moment. He was never built like the clean, heroic center of this universe. His strength comes from adaptation, from calculation, from knowing that in a world obsessed with physical dominance, information can cut deeper than steel. Now place that kind of man at the top of a house. What happens? That is where House of Ashur starts feeling less like a revival designed to trigger nostalgia and more like an experiment. It takes one of the most morally slippery figures in the Spartacus world and moves him into a position the old Ashur could only have dreamed about. Then it surrounds him with the same forces that have always defined this universe: status, class, violence, desire, performance, politics, and the desperate hunger to rise one step higher before somebody pushes you back down. And that is the emotional intention of this breakdown. I do not want to treat this story like a museum tour through old Spartacus memories. I want to look at whether the new series earns its return. I want to see if Ashur's survival creates something genuinely fresh, or whether it is simply a clever excuse to reopen a familiar arena. I want to examine how the show uses power differently when the central figure is not a rebel trying to escape the house, but a survivor trying to rule it. That reversal changes everything. Even the arena can mean something different now. For one character, it can be a prison, for another, a ladder. For someone watching from above, it can be business. For Rome, it can be theater. And for Ashur, it may be the place where every version of himself collides: the fighter he was, the servant he became, the manipulator people feared, and the master he now wants the world to recognize. So as we move through this box, keep your eye on one thing: who has control in each room, and how quickly can that control change? Watch who is allowed to speak, watch who has to perform. Watch who seems powerful only because someone more powerful has not entered yet. And watch the house itself. Because the most interesting thing about House of Ashur may not be that Ashur survived. It may be what survival taught him to become. The series officially begins from the alternate history question of Ashur living beyond Mount Vesuvius and being rewarded with Batiatus's former gladiator school, turning an old subordinate into the master of the system that shaped him. That premise is not just a gimmick, it is the mechanism beneath almost every question worth asking here. And before we get into production, performances, visual choices, politics, or spoilers, there is one thing we need to understand first. Why Ashur? Why this character? Why revive this world through the one man who seems least likely to give us a traditional Spartacus story? Because that choice is the hook. And once you see what the series gains, By putting Ashur at the center, the entire house starts looking different. Because the strangest thing about Spartacus House of Ashur is not that it brings back a character who was supposed to be gone. It is that the story gives him almost everything he once wanted, and then asks whether getting it is actually a victory. Ashur is the house, he has status, he has proximity to Roman power. He has people beneath him instead of constantly having somebody standing above him. From a distance, it looks like the ultimate reversal. The survivor finally reaches the top of the structure that spent so long reminding him where he belonged. But look closer. The house does not suddenly become safe because Ashur owns it. Rome does not become merciful because Ashur serves it. And power does not erase the memory of humiliation. That is what makes this setup immediately dangerous. Ashur understands systems because he has spent his life trapped inside them. He knows that strength alone does not determine who survives. He knows favors matter, reputation matters, secrets matter, timing matters. He knows that a smile can hide a threat and that the person standing beside you today may be calculating what your disappearance could buy them tomorrow. Now he has to live inside the environment he once manipulated from below, while everyone around him begins calculating the same thing about him. That is the reversal. The schemer becomes the target of schemes. The observer becomes the person everyone is observing. The man who survived by finding weaknesses must now somehow make sure nobody finds his. And suddenly Ashur's greatest talent becomes his greatest problem. He cannot stop seeing the trap. Imagine living like that. Every compliment might contain an agenda. Every alliance might have an expiration date. Every victory creates another person who wants what you possess. You can acquire authority, but authority does not automatically create security. In fact, sometimes it creates the opposite. The higher Ashur rises, the more visible he becomes. That is where the series finds a hook far more interesting than simply asking whether a familiar character can survive another season of blood and politics. Survival used to mean getting through the next dangerous moment. Now survival means maintaining an entire position, and those are very different challenges. A fighter can identify the opponent standing across the sand. A master of a house has enemies he may never see coming. That tension changes the atmosphere of the entire Spartacus formula. We already know what rebellion feels like in this world. We know what it means when people with nothing left decide they would rather risk everything than remain chained. But what happens when the central figure is somebody who does not want to destroy the hierarchy? What if he wants the hierarchy to finally recognize him? That is much more uncomfortable. Because Ashur's dream is not necessarily freedom from the machine, his dream is to move upward inside it. And if the machine is cruel, then success inside that machine comes with a question the story cannot avoid. How much cruelty must you accept before your success becomes participation? There is our second clue. The house has changed hands. The mechanism has not disappeared. That distinction gives House of Ashur its pulse. You can change the person sitting in the chair without changing what the chair represents. You can replace the master without eliminating mastery. You can survive oppression and still learn the wrong lesson from surviving it. That is why Ashur is such a dangerous character to build this experiment around. A straightforward hero would give us an obvious moral direction. Ashur does not. With him, almost every victory can carry two meanings. When he outmaneuvers someone, part of you may admire the intelligence. Then another part of you wonders what that intelligence is being used to protect. When he refuses to be humiliated, you understand exactly where that reaction comes from. But understanding a wound is not the same thing as approving everything a wounded person does with power. And that tension is where the series can keep pulling you forward. You are not simply waiting to see whether Ashur succeeds. You are watching to discover what success means to him. Does he want respect, fear, belonging, revenge, security, a permanent place in a Roman world that once saw him as disposable? Those desires can look similar when someone is climbing. They become very different once that person reaches the top. And beneath all the spectacle, that may be the most compelling promise of this story. Ashur has spent years reading everyone else. Now the series forces us to read Ashur. not as a side character moving between stronger personalities, not merely as an obstacle, not as the man whispering from the edge of someone else's story. He is standing in the center now. There is nowhere for him to hide. Every choice reveals something, every compromise costs something. Every demonstration of authority tells us what he believes power is actually for. And if the show understands that, then the arena becomes only one battlefield. The real fight is occurring everywhere. At the table, behind closed doors, inside alliances, inside the difference between how Ashur sees himself and how Rome sees him, inside the question of whether a man can truly become master of a system that can still destroy him whenever it chooses. So that is the hook I want you to hold on to. Not simply Ashur survived, something much more dangerous. Ashur survived long enough to become powerful. Now we get to discover whether power is the reward he imagined or the final trap the house was waiting to close around him. And to understand why this particular alternate path exists at all, we need to move away from Ashur for a moment and look behind the lens. Because the decision to reopen this world was itself a gamble. That gamble starts with Stephen S. DeKnight himself, because House of Ashur was not born from the most obvious continuation of Spartacus. According to DeKnight, Stars and Lionsgate had approached him over the years about returning to this universe. When the timing finally worked, he considered some of the historical directions you might expect from a franchise built around Rome, Caesar, the triumvirate, Antony and Cleopatra. But his attention returned to something much smaller and stranger, Ashur's old ambition to establish a house of his own, an ambition the original story never allowed him to fulfill. From there came the alternate history idea. What if Ashur survived long enough to actually become the man he imagined himself becoming? That production origin tells us something important before we examine a single arena sequence. This series was not designed by asking who is the biggest character we can bring back. It was designed around unfinished possibility, and that is a much better reason to reopen a franchise. Because Caesar could have produced a larger historical canvas, another famous Roman figure could have given the show instant importance. But Ashur creates fiction. He forces the writers to operate in the uncomfortable space between familiarity and reinvention. You recognize the world, you recognize the men, but the relationship between those two things has completely changed. It also explains why this series feels comfortable breaking history rather than pretending to be another straightforward historical chapter. DeKnight has described his interest in exploring how Ashur remaining alive causes the known path of events to veer in another direction. That means the creative team gives itself permission to ask a more useful, dramatic question than what really happened. It can ask, what happens because this particular man is still here? That distinction is crucial. Historical fiction normally carries a kind of invisible destination. Even when you do not know every detail, history itself is waiting somewhere ahead. The major names have established fates. Empires have established outcomes. Rebellions have endings. Alternate history weakens that safety rail. Suddenly, survival becomes disruptive. One changed life can move another life. One new alliance can prevent an expected decision. One person being present in a room where history says he should be absent can change what everyone else is allowed to become. So Ashur is not merely resurrected. He becomes a disturbance in the timeline. That choice allows House of Ashur to preserve the texture of the original universe while refusing to become trapped by its destination. And then there is the physical world itself. Production on the 10-episode season was announced as underway in New Zealand in July 2024, continuing the franchise's long relationship with the country. Stars confirmed the production there when it announced the expanded cast. But the scale behind that sentence is bigger than it sounds. The New Zealand Film Commission says the series was filmed entirely across Aotearoa, New Zealand, involved nearly 900 crew members, used purpose-built studio sets, and had almost all of its post-production and visual effects work completed by New Zealand vendors. And this is where a production fact becomes a visual clue. Spartacus has never tried to make ancient Rome feel like a neutral historical reconstruction. This franchise has always had a heightened visual identity. Its world is aggressive, bodies become shapes in the frame, architecture becomes intimidation, color becomes emotion. The arena does not simply look like a location where something happens. It feels like a stage designed to transform violence, status, and spectacle into public theater. Returning to a production ecosystem already deeply connected to that language matters because visual continuity in a revival is difficult. Wait too long, replace too many creative habits, modernize everything too aggressively, and a returning franchise can feel like actors performing inside an expensive imitation of its former self. But House of Ashur has an advantage. It is not trying to discover what a Spartacus world should look like from zero. New Zealand crews have established that world in the first place. Executive producer Rick Jacobson went so far as to credit Kiwi filmmakers as fundamental to the franchise's success and argued that Spartacus could not be made anywhere else. You can feel the logic behind that statement. The challenge is not simply rebuilding Rome, it is rebuilding this version of Rome, a Rome that can feel theatrical without becoming weightless, artificial without becoming cheap, stylized without losing physical danger. That balance depends on hundreds of small decisions across lighting, costume, construction, stunt work, camera placement, digital environments, extras, makeup, editing, and effects. So when the new series places Ashur inside the Ludus, the house has to trigger memory before the story begins explaining anything. Walls matter. Balconies matter. Training spaces matter. The distance between the people above and the people below matters. Production design becomes hierarchy made physical. That is why returning to New Zealand is more than a logistical footnote. It helps the revival speak with the accent of the original series while telling a different story. Then the casting introduces another deliberate disruption. Stars then announced Danica Davis as Achillia, described officially as the first female gladiator in the Spartacus television universe, alongside returning lead Nick E., Tarabay, and a new ensemble including Graham McTavish, Claudia Black, Ivana Baquero, Jamaica Vaughan, Jordi Weber, India Shaw-Smith, and Lee Gill. The important production decision there is not simply adding another fighter. It is challenging one of the arena's most established visual assumptions. The gladiatorial world in Spartacus has always been intensely connected to masculinity, male bodies displayed, trained, valued, punished, sold, celebrated, and turned into symbols of status. Putting a woman directly inside that mechanism creates immediate resistance, not because the show has suddenly abandoned what it was, because it has found a way to test what that word claims to believe. If the arena supposedly rewards strength, what happens when strength appears in a person the society surrounding the arena refuses to treat equally? Now, spectacle and prejudice collide. The crowd can be impressed by what it sees, while the social order remains offended by what that performance represents. That gives the creative team another tool for exposing Rome, not through a speech about inequality, through contradiction. A person proves capability. The system still searches for a reason to deny legitimacy, and notice how neatly that connects back to Ashur. He understands that experience, not in exactly the same way, but he knows what it means to possess usefulness without possessing acceptance. He knows the difference between being needed and being respected. So placing a disruptive gladiator inside Ashur's disruptive house is not random casting decoration. It puts pressure on the central idea from another direction. Who gets to rise? Who decides? And what happens when somebody succeeds in a role society had already decided was not meant for them? Finally, the most important behind the lens continuity may be the simplest one. DeKnight returned as creator, writer, showrunner, and executive producer, with Rick Jacobson and Aaron Helbing also serving as executive producers. Lionsgate Television produced the series for Stars. That continuity matters because Spartacus has an unusually specific storytelling rhythm. The language is heightened, the emotions are enormous. Politics can become intimate within seconds. Intimacy can become strategy. An apparently simple conversation can function like combat because everyone is trying to understand who has leverage. Bring back only the title and the iconography, and you could easily produce something that resembles Spartacus without understanding its internal machinery. Bringing the knight back gives House of Ashur access to the person who helped establish that machinery. But continuity also creates a challenge. You cannot survive entirely on recognition. The blood, the arena, the political manipulation, the heightened Roman world, those things can open the door. They cannot carry the whole series. A revival has to justify the second visit, and put these production choices together and the strategy becomes visible. Return to the filmmaking environment that helped build the franchise. Return to a creator who understands its unusual voice. Return to an actor whose character still contains unfinished dramatic potential. Then introduce new characters capable of challenging the old rules rather than merely recreating old relationships. That is the mechanism behind the resurrection. Familiar structure, different pressure. The box looks recognizable from the outside, but the compartments have been rearranged. And now that we understand why this house was rebuilt, we can finally open the front door and define exactly what Spartacus House of Ashur is trying to be. So what exactly have we opened? Spartacus House of Ashur is a 2025 Stars action drama series created and showrun by Stephen S. DeKnight, built as a history-bending continuation of the Spartacus universe rather than a conventional sequel. It premiered on December 5 to 2025 with Nikki Tarabay returning as Ashur. Claire McTavish plays Chorus, Tinica Davis plays Achillia, Claudia Black plays Kosutia, Jamaica, Vaughn plays Haida, Ivana Baquero plays Messia, Jordi Weber plays Tarshan, India Shaw Smith plays Vidya, and Lee Gill plays Satyrus. The season uses multiple directors, with longtime Spartacus collaborator Rick Jacobson directing the opening episodes and serving as an executive producer. And my spoiler-free verdict before we go any deeper is simple. This works much better than the premise has any right to. Because resurrecting a character from a completed story is dangerous. It can feel desperate. It can weaken an earlier ending. It can turn nostalgia into a substitute for storytelling. And when the character being resurrected is Ashur, a man whose importance originally came partly from the fact that he was moving around the edges of other people's stories, the risk becomes even greater. Make him the center, and everything has to change. That is exactly what House of Ashur understands. It does not attempt to turn Ashur into Spartacus. That would be the easiest way to destroy the idea. Spartacus carried the moral force of rebellion. His story was fundamentally directed outward. He looked at the structure imprisoning him and eventually decided that the structure itself had to fall. Ashur is almost the inverse. He looks at the structure and asks how high he can climb inside it. That creates a completely different kind of protagonist. You are not following a man because you automatically believe in his cause. You are following him because his decisions are unpredictable, his intelligence is dangerous, and every small victory forces you to reconsider what kind of person you are watching. That makes House of Ashur less of a rebellion story and more of a power story, and those are not interchangeable. The official premise takes the ending of Spartacus' vengeance and deliberately fractures it. Instead of dying at Mount Vesuvius, Ashur survives in this alternate timeline and is rewarded by Rome with the gladiator school once belonging to Batiatus. He becomes dominus of the very institution where he once suffered beneath someone else's authority. That is why this series exists. Not because the original Spartacus story secretly required another chapter. It did not. The original saga had reached its destination. House of Ashur exists because somebody noticed that one unroused ambition could function like a doorway into an entirely different version of the same world. Ashur once wanted elevation. Now the story lets him have it. Then it examines the consequences. That distinction matters enormously. This is not what happened next. It is what could have happened instead. An alternate history gives the series a freedom a direct sequel would not possess. The old world becomes raw material rather than a cage. Familiar institutions return, but their relationships can shift. Characters who should never have crossed paths can affect one another. Established history no longer guarantees where the road ends. The series can use your memory of Spartacus against you. You recognize the rules. Then the story starts changing the pieces. At its heart, though, this is not really a story about gladiators. Gladiators provide the spectacle. Rome provides the pressure. The ludus provides the arena in which competing ambitions collide. But beneath all of that, House of Ashur is about legitimacy. Ashur has power. But does anyone believe he deserves it? He has a house. But does owning something make him belong among the people who believe men like him should remain beneath them? He can command gladiators. But can he command respect? Those questions explain why Achillia becomes such an important counterweight to him, even without discussing where her story eventually goes. Stars introduced her as the first female gladiator in the televised The Spartacus universe, someone determined to prove herself inside a world structured against that possibility. So both central forces enter the story with a legitimacy problem. Ashur has climbed somewhere Roman society does not comfortably want him. Achillia is trying to fight somewhere Roman tradition does not comfortably want her. Different circumstances, different obstacles, but the same uncomfortable question hangs over both of them. Who gets to decide where somebody belongs? That choice gives the show more substance than its surface promises. Because yes, if you love the original Spartacus, much of the attraction is immediately recognizable. The heightened dialogue, political maneuvering, arena spectacle, large personalities colliding over status, sex, ambition, betrayal, and violence functioning as extensions of power, that operatic excess remains part of the franchise's DNA. But if that is all you want, you may actually miss what makes this continuation interesting. The better material happens when spectacle exposes hierarchy. A gladiator's performance can alter political value. A social invitation can become a battlefield. A person's apparent rise can reveal how little power they truly possess. An insult can matter because it identifies exactly where Roman society believes someone belongs. That is the real game. And it is why I think this series is especially worth your time if you already understand the original Spartacus world. You will recognize the architecture, but you will enter through another door. If you love the original only because you are emotionally attached to Spartacus himself, this may initially feel strange. Ashur is intentionally more difficult company. The show does not hand you the teen emotional alignment that a traditional hero provides. You have to negotiate your relationship with him. Sometimes you understand him. Sometimes you admire the move. Sometimes you see the calculation coming and still enjoy watching it land. And sometimes the very thing that makes Ashur effective reminds you exactly why trusting him is dangerous. That instability is the point. For newcomers, the series can still function as a brutal Roman power drama, but familiarity with the earlier franchise gives the central reversal much greater weight. Knowing who Ashur was changes how you read every symbol of authority he now possesses, because every room contains a ghost of his previous position. Every command carries the memory of when he had to obey. Every display of ownership reminds us that he once belonged to someone else. Put those details together and our original clue becomes even sharper. The house is not simply Ashur's reward, it is his test. It contains everything he thought he wanted, everything he escaped, and everything he risks becoming. And now that we know what kind of box we are opening, there is one final thing to establish before we start pulling apart the filmmaking itself. What does it actually feel like when that box opens for the first time? Because the opening minutes have a difficult job. They have to convince us that this impossible timeline belongs in the Spartacus universe, and they have to do it before nostalgia loses its power. The opening does something I did not expect. It makes Ashur's return feel less like a correction and more like a nightmare that has somehow learned how to become reality. Instead of pretending nothing happened to him, House of Ashur begins in a strange space between death, memory, and possibility. Ashur encounters Lucretia, with Lucy Lawless briefly returning to the world of Spartacus, and the series uses that encounter to establish its alternate path before pushing Ashur into the life he was never supposed to have. That is a smart first move, because the biggest obstacle facing this show is not Rome, it is us. We remember what happened. We know Ashur's original fate. The series cannot simply place him back on screen and expect the contradiction to disappear. So it does almost the opposite. It looks directly at that contradiction. For a moment, the opening feels dreamlike, almost theatrical, as though the franchise itself is standing over Ashur and asking whether we are willing to follow one more possibility. Then the door opens, and suddenly he is not the man whose story ended on Vesuvius. He is Dominus. That transition immediately gives the opening a peculiar emotional flavor. There is triumph in it, but the triumph feels unstable. Ashur has acquired the external symbols of success, yet the atmosphere does not tell you that he has finally arrived somewhere safe. Quite the opposite. The house feels like something he must constantly prove he deserves. And I think that is what hooked me during those opening minutes. Not the simple novelty of seeing Ashur alive. The novelty disappears quickly. What replaces it is anxiety. Because once the show establishes the new timeline, it immediately confronts Ashur with a more humiliating reality. Possessing a ludus does not automatically make his ludus respected, and calling himself a master does not force Roman society to see him as one. The official episode premise centers on exactly that pressure. Ashur owns the former house of Batiatus, but still wants the respect and influence he has spent so long chasing, and his house needs something capable of attracting attention in the arena. That is where the opening becomes unmistakably Spartacus again. Status is never stable. Everybody is performing for somebody. The gladiators perform for the crowd. The house performs for Rome. Ashur performs the role of a man who belongs among the elite, and Rome sits above all of them, deciding whose performance has value. There is a fantastic irony in that. Ashur once lived inside the ludus as someone whose worth could be measured by stronger people. Now he stands above it, yet his own worth is still being measured. Only the judges have changed. That makes the early atmosphere very different from the heroic momentum you might expect from a returning franchise. There is no comforting victory lap. The series feels restless, competitive, almost insecure by design. It understands that Ashur himself is insecure, even when he is projecting confidence. And that insecurity infects the house. You can sense that everything needs to become bigger, sharper, more impressive, because mediocrity is not merely disappointing here, it is dangerous. A weak gladiator reflects on the master. A fair spectacle becomes a political embarrassment. An unimpressed Roman can close doors that Ashur desperately needs open. So even before the larger story expands, the first 10 minutes establish the basic economy of this world. Attention becomes currency, reputation becomes armor, and humiliation becomes a threat. That is exactly the kind of world Ashur was designed to inhabit. What also surprised me was how little time the series spends apologizing for itself. A weaker revival might have drowned the opening in explanation. Here is everything you need to remember. Here is why Ashur survived. Here is the altered timeline. Here are the references you should recognize. Instead, the resurrection is established quickly, the new status quo is introduced, and the show moves forward. Contemporary reviews notice that same approach. The alternate continuity is sketched efficiently rather than turned into an elaborate mythology lesson. I appreciated that, because an alternate history premise becomes exhausting if the story spends every scene defending why it exists. Eventually, the show has to behave as though this world is real, and House of Ashur gets there fast. Then something else happens. The visual and verbal aggression of the original franchise returns almost immediately. The heightened speech, the exaggerated personalities, the sense that conversations are never simply conversations, the stylized physicality, the arena mentality leaking into spaces far beyond the arena. For someone familiar with Spartacus, there is an almost immediate recognition, not nostalgia exactly. Recognition. You hear the rhythm and think, yes, this is that world. You see how people occupy rooms and understand that dominance is being negotiated before anyone openly admits it. But there is also a risk built into that familiarity. The original Spartacus had such a strong stylistic identity that reproducing its surface can become self-parody very easily. Push the dialogue 1 degree too far and it becomes imitation. Push the spectacle without emotional weight and it becomes noise. Push the visual excess without purpose and it becomes an empty reminder of what the franchise used to do. During the opening, I could feel the show walking that line. And for me, it mostly stays on the right side of it. My 8.2 out of 10 rating starts making sense here. I am not watching something flawless. I am watching something that understands the personality it needs to recover while also finding a reason not to merely reproduce the past. The reason is Ashur. The original series could use spectacle as fuel for rebellion. House of Ashur uses spectacle as fuel for ambition. That difference sounds small. It changes the entire engine. And then the series starts showing us why Ashur's house needs something new. His position may have changed, but his gladiatorial operation is not automatically a triumph. Early in the premiere, his political prospects are connected directly to the performance of the fighters representing his name, turning the quality of the looters into an extension of Ashur's own reputation. There it is again. The clue keeps returning. Ownership. Ashur owns the house, but the house also owns his future. If it fails, he fails. If his fighters are laughed at, that laughter reaches him. If he cannot produce spectacle worth remembering, his title becomes decoration. That is why I found it difficult to look away. Not because I immediately loved Ashur. The series does not need me to. It needs me to become interested in the distance between what he has and what he wants. He has survived. He wants legitimacy. He has a title. He wants recognition. He has a house. He wants the Roman world to admit that the man standing inside it matters, and those opening minutes make one thing very clear. Rome is not going to give him that admission easily, which means Ashur needs an advantage, something unexpected, something capable of disrupting the arena instead of merely participating in it. And once that need appears, the visual language of the series becomes even more important because House of Ashur is about to prove that its camera, lighting, editing, production design, and spectacle are not simply decorating this world. They are explaining who controls it. They are explaining who controls it because House of Ashur rarely treats the camera as an invisible observer. This is not naturalistic Rome. It is Rome pushed through memory, myth, theater, and graphic novel exaggeration until every room feels slightly larger than reality, and every confrontation feels as though somebody has already placed it on a stage. That was essential to preserve. Stephen S.T. Knight has said that much of the original department leadership returned, including the production designer, costume designer, and stunt coordinator, because the intention was for House of Ashur to feel as though it could have followed the original series almost immediately, rather than arriving more than a decade later. And you can see the philosophy behind that decision. The series does not chase modern prestige TV realism. It does not suddenly soften everything into grey stone, natural sunlight, handheld cameras, and restrained visual understatement. It remembers that Spartacus developed his identity by doing almost the opposite. The image is supposed to feel designed, the contrast is supposed to feel aggressive. Bodies, architecture, fabric, metal, firelight, shadow, and open sky are arranged so that the frame itself seems to understand hierarchy. Look at the ludus as an idea. There are people above. There are people below. There are observers. There are performers. There are owners. There are owned. That relationship can be communicated before anyone says a word simply by deciding where a character stands inside the frame. Put Ashur on an elevated platform looking downward, and the image declares his new position. But frame him opposite a senator who carries greater social power, and suddenly Ashur's ownership of the ludus means much less. The surroundings may belong to him, the social frame does not. That is one of the smartest visual ideas available to the series. Power is relative. The camera can make somebody dominant in one shot and vulnerable in the next without changing the character at all. Only the relationship changes. And because House of Ashur is constantly testing who outranks whom, framing becomes a quiet extension of the screenplay. Then there is movement. The arena sequences retain the franchise's famous manipulation of time. using bursts of acceleration and slow motion to transform combat from straightforward physical action into spectacle. Critics repeatedly noted the return of that stylized slow-motion visual language rather than a shift toward purely realistic action photography. But the important part is why that works here. Slow motion separates an instant from ordinary time. Suddenly, a movement is not merely happening, it is being displayed. That distinction mirrors what gladiatorial combat means inside the story. These fights are performances. The crowd is supposed to see them. A master needs people to remember them. Reputation can change because of them. So when the filmmaking stretches a decisive movement, it places us temporarily in the same position as the Roman crowd. We are being told where spectacle lives. Then editing takes that spectacle and controls its rhythm. The series frequently creates contrast between anticipation and release. A confrontation can spend time establishing faces, posture, distance, and expectation before exploding into rapid movement. Then the rhythm can suddenly stretch again. That variation matters. If every second moved at maximum speed, none of it would feel important. Instead, acceleration and suspension work like punctuation. Build, strike, hold, react, move again. The editing turns physical action into a series of emotional beats rather than an undifferentiated blur. That is particularly important in this franchise because action rarely exists only to determine who wins. A fight can change the status of a gladiator. It can embarrass a house. It can attract Roman attention. It can make someone politically useful. So the editor is not merely cutting for impact. The editor is helping convert physical performance into social consequence. The lighting works in a similar way. House of Ashur favors dramatic contrast and an intentionally heightened visual texture, rather than pretending that every interior is being illuminated by perfectly realistic ancient light sources. Reviews of the series have specifically highlighted its dramatic lighting and its continuation of the franchise's stylized look, and that heightened approach suits Ashur perfectly. He exists in moral half-light. He is rarely a character you can reduce to one simple intention. The interiors often feel more enclosed and controlled than the open arena, creating a useful contradiction. Outside, violence may be visible. Inside, danger becomes social. Faces emerge from shadow. Warm surfaces can surround cold intentions. Wealth can make a room beautiful without making anyone inside it safe. Production design strengthens that idea. The sets do not function merely as historical decoration, they create territories. The Ludus is simultaneously workplace, prison, business, home, training ground, and symbol of Ashur's legitimacy. Roman spaces communicate wealth differently. Arena spaces communicate public judgment. Private chambers change the rules again. The Los Angeles Times praised the evident investment in the show sets, costumes, effects, and complicated action staging, while DeKnight has emphasized the importance of returning to New Zealand and reuniting much of the original production team to preserve the franchise's visual DNA. That continuity matters most when the design stops calling attention to itself. You do not need someone explaining the hierarchy because the architecture already separates people. A staircase can become status. A doorway can become surveillance. A balcony can transform one person into spectator and another into spectacle. Put those details together. The mechanism becomes visible. This entire world is arranged around being watched. Gladiators are watched by masters. Masters are watched by elites. Elites watch one another. Ashur watches everyone because information is one of his weapons, and the camera watches all of them. That is why the heightened visual texture does not bother me even when it occasionally approaches excess. Excess is part of the language. The series is not trying to convince you that someone secretly carried a modern camera into ancient Capua. It is trying to make Rome feel emotionally truthful through visual exaggeration. Ambition should look enormous, humiliation should feel public, danger should arrive before the weapon does, power should occupy space. The effects work follows the same principle. Visual effects company Cause and FX has described the Spartacus franchise as heavily dependent on digital work for environments, crowded arenas, and battle imagery. And House of Ashur continues the tradition. of blending constructed spaces with expanded environments. That artificiality is sometimes visible, but strangely, complete invisibility is not necessarily the goal. The franchise has always occupied a space between physical Rome and imagined Rome. It wants the world to feel like a legend being violently illustrated in front of you. So, digital extensions, theatrical skies, heightened contrast, stylized movement, and design compositions all belong to the same visual sentence. And perhaps the best decision is that House of Ashur does not apologize for any of it. It understands its own grammar. A different series would look ridiculous using these techniques. Here they are part of the identity. More importantly, they serve the new central character. Spartacus was a man trying to escape a system. Ashur is a man trying to control one. So the filmmaking keeps arranging people into levels, flames, stages, and viewing positions. Again and again, somebody believes they are controlling the spectacle. Then the perspective changes, and we discover that they were being watched by someone else. That is how House of Ashur turns style into meaning. The blood, stone, shadows, slow motion, architecture, costumes, and aggressive editing may attract your eye first, but beneath all of them is the same question we started with: who owns the house? And who only thinks they do? Now we have to follow that question through the story itself, not scene by scene, but through the handful of choices that transform Ashur's new position from an impossible reward into something far more complicated. So the causal path begins with the humiliation. Ashur has received the thing that once seemed impossible. Batiatus is former Ludus. Rome has elevated him from somebody who survived by making himself useful to somebody expected to prove that his name itself has value. But the gift comes with a hidden condition. Owning a gladiator school means nothing if the school cannot produce glory. Ashur needs recognition. Recognition requires spectacle. Spectacle requires gladiators capable of making Rome look toward his house rather than past it. That is the first mechanism driving the story. His central want is not money alone, it is legitimacy. And legitimacy is exactly what Rome refuses to give him automatically. The opening competition makes that painfully clear. Ashur attempts to establish his house through a fighter he believes can represent him, only for the result to expose how weak his position actually is. The defeat leaves him needing something capable of making the house of Ashur impossible to dismiss. This is important because Ashur does not respond to failure by abandoning the system. He studies the failure. That is the old Ashur surviving inside the new Dominus. He understands something fundamental about Roman entertainment. Being technically competent is not enough. You have to be memorable. That realization leads him toward Achillia, and this is where the story's central relationship begins. Ashur does not initially see Achillia in purely heroic terms. He sees possibility, novelty, a fighter who could give his house an identity nobody else possesses. Officially, the story positions Achillia as a woman entering gladiatorial training, while Ashur attempts to navigate Roman elite politics, immediately tying her fight for acceptance to his fight for social standing. That connection matters because both characters need something from the other. Achillia needs access to the arena. Ashur needs someone capable of transforming his house from a joke into a threat. Their goals overlap without becoming identical, and that difference creates tension. For Ashur, Achillia can become an asset. For Achillia, becoming an asset may be the only available path toward proving that everyone who has already judged her is wrong. So even before the arena, her battle begins inside the Ludus. The men training there do not simply see another competitor. Her presence challenges the logic by which they understand themselves. If gladiatorial birth is supposed to come from skill, discipline, endurance, and victory, then a capable woman should theoretically be judged by those same standards. But prejudice reveals that the system was never as merit-based as its defenders pretend. The resistance against Achillia therefore does more than create personal conflict. It exposes a contradiction. Rome loves exceptional spectacle, but it also loves rigid categories. Achillia can satisfy one desire only by violating the other. Ashur sees the commercial potential in that violation. Chorus sees the danger of putting an unprepared fighter into a brutal environment. The other gladiators see a threat to an identity they believe belonged exclusively to them, and Achillia sees a test she cannot afford to fail. The series gradually turns that conflict into training, rivalry, and reluctant recognition. Chorus himself becomes part of the mechanism when Achillia demonstrates enough ability to force him to reconsider what he initially assumes about her. Notice what the story is doing. Ashur's problem was originally external. Rome does not respect his house. He responds by bringing someone into the house the house itself struggles to respect. The same hierarchy repeats at a smaller scale. Ashur wants Rome to look beyond his origin. Achillia wants the ludus to look beyond hers. Yet Ashur does not immediately recognize the hypocrisy. That makes their relationship much more interesting than a simple mentor and fighter arrangement. He can identify injustice when it affects his own advancement. The harder question is whether he can recognize it when he benefits from being the person holding power. Meanwhile, Chorus becomes crucial because he represents something Ashur cannot manufacture through title alone: authority earned through experience. Official episode descriptions make his conflict with Ashur increasingly significant. Chorus is forced to prove his worth, and later the story escalates toward Chorus demanding blood after a devastating turn. That distinction between Ashur and Chorus is fascinating. Ashur owns the ludus. Chorus understands the fighters. Those are different kinds of power. A command can force obedience. It cannot necessarily produce loyalty. And every time Ashur treats the people beneath him as pieces on a board, the series quietly asks whether he has learned anything from being treated the same way. That is where his old survival instincts become dangerous. Ashur is excellent at turning relationships into leverage. When access to Roman games becomes difficult, he does not simply wait for somebody to invite him. He looks for pressure points, connections, favors, weaknesses, people who can open doors. By the fourth episode, his immediate objective has become securing a place at the Ludi Apollinaris before Marcus Crassus arrives, turning participation in the games into a political necessity rather than merely an athletic opportunity. This is where the story expands. The ludus is no longer just a training school. It becomes Ashur's political instrument. A successful gladiator can purchase attention. Attention can purchase access. Access can become influence. Influence can protect Ashur from people who still consider his rise an insult. Suddenly, a fighter stepping into the arena is carrying far more than a weapon. They are carrying the reputation of the entire house. That is why Achillia's eventual public emergence matters so much. By the fifth episode, Ashur finally presents her before the Roman public for a first arena battle. This is not merely the payoff to training, it is Ashur placing his theory before Rome. He has gambled that difference can become value, that the very thing people reject privately can fascinate them publicly. And this is one of the show's sharpest observations about spectacle. Societies frequently condemn what they also cannot stop watching. Rome's rigid order says Achillia should not occupy this position. Rome's appetite for entertainment makes her irresistible precisely because she occupies it. Ashur exploits the contradiction. That is what he does best, but exploitation has consequences. Because the moment Achillia succeeds as spectacle, she stops being merely Ashur's unusual gamble. She begins acquiring a reputation of her own. And once a person becomes valuable independently, ownership gets complicated. Who created whom? Does Achillia need Ashur because he gave her access? Or does Ashur need Achillia because her success gives his house relevance? The balance starts shifting. This is our original clue developing another meaning. Ashur owns the house. He owns the business. According to Roman law and custom within this world, he exercises enormous control over the people inside it. But he cannot completely own what the crowd feels. He cannot simply command admiration. He has to create conditions that produce it. And once the crowd begins investing emotionally in a gladiator, that fighter possesses a kind of power even a Dominus cannot manufacture for himself. That mechanism drives Ashur upward. The official synopsis for the sixth episode states that his popularity in Capua rises dramatically, but that the success arrives at a devastating cost. That phrase, at a cost, is where the series changes temperature. Until this point, Ashur can almost convince himself that cleverness will always produce another escape route. That is the fantasy he has arrived on. If somebody blocks one door, manipulate another person. If one fighter fails, find another. If society mocks you, create something it cannot ignore. Every problem appears solvable through strategy. But power stories become meaningful when strategy meets something it cannot undo. Loss, consequences. The emotional damage caused by treating human beings as movable pieces. And Ashur begins encountering exactly that. The higher his profile becomes, the less private any decision remains. Every alliance creates an enemy. Every success alters somebody else's interests. Every person he values becomes a possible source of leverage against him. The house that was supposed to prove his freedom begins accumulating vulnerabilities. Chorus's growing conflict is part of that. Achillia's rising importance is part of it. Ashur's relationships inside his own household become part of it. And above all of them stands Roman politics. Because Ashur can dominate the Ludus and still remain subordinate to men whose authority reaches far beyond his walls. That becomes unmistakable as the season moves toward Caesar. By the ninth episode, the official premise reduces Ashur's situation to a brutal sentence. Caesar demands a painful sacrifice from him. That is the logical destination of everything we have been tracking. Ashur wanted to enter the Roman power structure. Eventually, the Roman power structure sends in the bill. This is why his rise cannot be understood as simple liberation. He has gained authority downward. He has not escaped authority above. He can command the people inside the ludus. But Rome can still place him in situations where every available choice carries loss. That is not freedom. It is a more luxurious form of dependence. And the tragedy, or perhaps the dark joke, is that Ashur understands this kind of system better than almost anyone. He knows what powerful men do. He knows how people become disposable. He knows their promises are temporary. He knows loyalty frequently lasts only until ambition offers a better price. Yet knowledge does not automatically create escape. Sometimes knowledge merely allows you to recognize the trap while it closes. Achillia travels in the opposite direction. She begins with almost no institutional power, but through discipline and survival, she becomes increasingly difficult for the system to ignore. Later episodes center on her preparing to return to the arena and ultimately facing her greatest combat challenge. So Ashur moves from outsider toward establishment. Achillia moves from possession toward identity. One collects titles, the other collects proof. One believes control creates security. The other discovers that the crowd's recognition can create a form of influence the rules never intended to give her. Put those trajectories together and the real story appears. This is not merely the rise of the house of Ashur. It is a battle over who gets to define value inside that house. Ashur thinks his intelligence makes him the author. Rome believes Ashur himself remains a useful instrument. The gladiators know that without their bodies and performances, the house has nothing to sell. Achillia gradually becomes evidence that a person introduced as somebody else's strategy can develop a story that exceeds the strategist. And Chorus keeps reminding us that leadership without trust eventually becomes fragile. That is why I would not describe the season's central obstacle as one villain. The obstacle is the structure. Every character is trapped inside a ladder. Somebody is always higher. The gladiator answers to the ludus answers to political influence. Local power bends before greater Roman power, and everyone is trying to climb without being pulled down. Ashur believes he has escaped the bottom because he finally owns the ladder. What he gradually discovers is that he owns one section of it. That revelation gives the story its momentum. His greatest strength remains his ability to adapt, but every adaptation also pulls him deeper into the values of the world he once wanted to conquer. He becomes more successful at the game, and therefore more dependent on the game continuing. That is the cruel mechanism beneath the spectacle. The house succeeds. Ashur rises. Achillia becomes increasingly important. The political stakes expand. But instead of bringing Ashur closer to complete independence, each victory creates another obligation, another vulnerability. another person capable of demanding something from him. So, when the season finally forces Ashur to weigh power against the people and relationships that have accumulated around him, we are no longer asking whether he can outsmart one rival. We are asking whether the man who spent his life treating survival as the highest good has discovered anything he values more than survival itself. That is the point where ownership stops meaning possession. It starts meaning responsibility. And for Ashur, responsibility may be the one form of power he was never trained to carry. And this is the moment the box opens completely, and the first thing House of Ashur gets brilliantly right is understanding that Tarabay cannot play Ashur as though nothing has changed. The old Ashur often survived from the edge of the fame. He listened, calculated, waited for stronger men to reveal what they needed, then searched for a way to make himself useful. Here, Tarabay has to preserve that same intelligence while convincing us that Ashur has learned to occupy space differently. That is harder than it sounds. It cannot suddenly become physically imposing in the way Spartacus was. It cannot become a noble statesman without losing the character. He cannot become completely fearless, because insecurity is one of the engines beneath Ashur's ambition. So Tara replays power as something Ashur is constantly performing. Watch the confidence, then watch what happens when someone with greater Roman status enters the equation. The posture remains, the language remains sharp, but something underneath tightens. That tiny shift is the character. Ashur can order almost everyone inside his own wars around, yet he still remembers what it feels like to be the person waiting for another man's approval. Tarabay lets those two versions coexist instead of replacing one with the other. That makes the performance more interesting than a standard transformation from servant to master. The servant is still there. He is simply wearing the master's clothes, and opposite him, Thenika Davis gives the show a completely different energy as Achillia. Reviews were divided on the series overall, but several critics singled Davis out as one of its strongest presences. While stars built her first arena appearance into a major centerpiece of the season, what works about Achillia is that Davis does not play her as though she knows she is a revolutionary symbol. She plays the immediate problem, survive the training, read the opponent, control the fear, earn the next opportunity. That keeps the character grounded. The larger cultural meaning exists around her, but Achillia herself remains physical and immediate. She does not need to announce that she is disrupting the arena. Her existence there creates the disruption, and the performance becomes especially effective whenever you can see calculation replacing anger. Anybody can shout defiance. Achillia becomes more dangerous when she learns. She watches, adjusts, understands that being stronger is only one part of winning. That makes her an unexpectedly good mirror for Ashur. They have completely different positions, but both survive through adaptation. Graham McTavish gives the series another kind of strength as chorus. He has weight without needing to dominate every conversation. That is important because chorus represents authority that Ashur cannot buy, experience. When McTavish enters the scene, he carries the feeling of someone who has already witnessed enough suffering that threats alone will not impress him. His restraint becomes valuable precisely because so much of Spartacus is heightened. When everybody speaks like the world could end before dinner, the person who can remain still becomes powerful. Chorus gives the ludus a center of gravity, and that becomes structurally useful because Ashur needs someone near him who understands fighters as human beings rather than merely investments. Claudia Blight brings yet another weapon to the show. Kuzusha understands that aristocratic power rarely needs to announce itself. Black can deliver amusement like an insult, interest like an interrogation, courtesy like a warning. That is perfect for this universe because Roman politics works best when the scene has two conversations happening simultaneously. The polite one everyone can hear and the real one everyone understands. This is where the writing structure becomes one of the show's strongest elements. The story repeatedly links three economies. The arena produces spectacle, spectacle produces reputation, reputation produces political access. That chain is wonderfully efficient. A gladiator's success is therefore never isolated action. It affects Ashur. Ashur's status affects his political relationships. Those relationships affect what opportunities return to the house. The plot keeps circulating value through the same system. That is why the stronger episodes rarely feel as though the political material and gladiator material belong to separate television shows. One feeds the other. Ashur needs an arena purely because he needs social influence. A fighter needs Ashur because Ashur controls access. Roman elites need entertainment because public spectacle strengthens status. Everyone is using everyone. That structure is pure Spartacus. But the new series changes one crucial element. In the original saga, the audience could usually understand the emotional direction of freedom. Here, the structure deliberately makes success suspicious. If Ashur's house wins, that is exciting. But what exactly are we celebrating? A stronger institution for turning people into spectacle? A better position for Ashur inside Rome's hierarchy? A victory for Achillia that also increases her commercial value to the man who controls her? The show is at its best when it refuses to solve those contradictions for you. Direction and visual design reinforce the same idea. The arena is enormous because public judgment is enormous. Private chambers feel closer because political danger works through intimacy. Training spaces expose hierarchy physically. Balconies divide the watched from the watchers. And whenever the series moves from private preparation into public spectacle, it feels as though a hidden mechanism has suddenly opened its doors. The crowd changes everything. A fighter can be uncertain in private and become legend in public within minutes. That transformation is one reason Achillia's first arena appearance is, for me, the scene that crystallizes what House of Ashur does best. The series had spent time making her presence controversial before finally putting her where argument becomes irrelevant. The arena. Stars itself positioned episode 5 around Ashur publicly presenting Achillia for her first arena battle. What I love about that sequence is not simply the choreography. It is the accumulation around it. Ashur needs this to work. Achillia needs this to work for an entirely different reason. The crowd does not arrive prepared to validate either of them. And suddenly, physical performance becomes evidence. Every movement is answering a question that words could not settle. Does she belong here? Can Ashur's gamble produce something Rome cannot ignore? Can prejudice survive direct proof? The fight becomes story construction. That is what action should do. And the sound makes the scene land. The best audio choice is not simply impact, it is contrast. You have the density of the crowd, the pressure of anticipation, physical contact, breath, movement, and then moments where the rhythm gives one action enough space to register. The arena sounds alive because it is not merely background noise. The spectators are part of the weapon. Their reaction creates status. A silent crowd can destroy a performance. A roaring crowd can create a name. So sound becomes political. That is a clever extension of the show's central mechanism. Even the score works best when it pushes momentum rather than telling us exactly what emotion we are required to feel. The music gives the action scale, but the voices around the arena give it consequence. And this brings me to what I think the show does most brilliantly overall. It makes entertainment itself part of the plot. We are watching Spartacus partly because spectacle is exciting. The Romans inside Spartacus are watching gladiators for the same reason. The show knows that. Then it turns our enjoyment into something slightly uncomfortable. We want Achillia to enter the area because we want the sequence. Ashur wants her there because he wants what the sequence can buy him. Rome wants her there because novelty can become entertainment. Same event. Three completely different forms of desire. That is sophisticated construction hiding inside something deliberately outrageous. And when House of Ashur connects performance, politics, ambition, identity, and spectacle this tightly, it becomes more than a nostalgic return. It earns the right to exist. But earning that right does not mean every compartment works equally well, because the same excess that gives this series its personality also creates some of its biggest weaknesses. And those weaknesses matter precisely because the best material is strong enough to show us what the series could have been every single time. And the clearest weakness is pacing. House of Ashur has several genuinely strong ideas competing for the same amount of space. Ashur wants legitimacy. Achillia is trying to force open a place that Roman society does not naturally give her. Chorus represents another philosophy of leadership. The ludus needs victories. Roman elites are constantly calculating advantage. The alternate timeline itself needs enough explanation to feel coherent. Individually, these threads are interesting. The problem arises when the series tries to accelerate all of them at once. Some episodes move with tremendous confidence because one central objective pulls everything together. Ashur needs access. The house needs a victory. A political relationship has to shift. Those episodes feel sharp because every scene seems to tighten the same rope. Other stretches feel more crowded. A potentially important emotional development can arrive, make its point, and then be pushed aside because another political complication is already demanding attention. That does not destroy the story, but it occasionally prevents consequences from breathing, and consequences need breathing room in a series like this. If somebody is betrayed, humiliated, elevated, or lost, the emotional effect should not simply become fuel for the next mechanism. Sometimes we need to stay with what changed. The original Spartacus was often excellent at understanding this. For all its speed and excess, it knew when pain had altered a relationship permanently. House of Ashur occasionally becomes so interested in maintaining momentum that it reaches the next turn before the previous one has fully landed. That especially affects the supporting characters. Ashur is intentionally the center of the experiment, but the gravitational pull around him can become too strong. There are moments when another character seems fascinating precisely because they possess a worldview that could challenge his. Then the story needs them to perform a function, deliver information. Create an obstacle, supply an alliance, become leverage, move Ashur toward the next decision. Function is necessary in storytelling, but when you notice the function before you feel the person, the machinery becomes visible. Achillia sometimes carries the heaviest version of this problem. She is one of the show's strongest ideas, which also means the series asks her to represent several things simultaneously. She is a gladiator, an outsider, a commercial gamble for Ashur, a challenge to the masculine traditions surrounding the arena, a developing public figure, a mirror for Ashur's own struggle to be accepted by a hierarchy. Those connections are valuable. But there are moments when I wanted the show to temporarily forget what Achillia symbolizes and simply let her be complicated. Let her make a choice that does not exist primarily to prove a thematic point. Let her desire something inconvenient. Let success change her in a way Ashur did not predict. The performance often supplies that humanity, but the writing does not always give it equal space. Then there is the style. I said earlier that I admire how confidently House of Ashur returns to the exaggerated visual and verbal language of the franchise. I still do. But confidence and restraint are not opposites. Sometimes this series forgets that. The heightened dialogue is effective when every unusual phrase feels like a weapon. It becomes less effective when everyone sounds equally determined to produce the most Spartacus sounding sentence in the room. The difference is subtle. At its best, the language creates character. Ashur speaks one way because manipulation is part of his survival mechanism. An aristocrat may speak differently because social superiority means they rarely need to expose their intention directly. A gladiator should carry another rhythm entirely. When those distinctions blur, style begins replacing voice. And once that happens, the series can briefly feel like it is performing its own memory. The same applies visually. Slow motion is powerful when it identifies the decisive instant. If too many instants are treated as decisive, the technique loses hierarchy. Stylized blood, dramatic skies, aggressive transitions, and heightened movement are part of the franchise's identity. But every stylistic signature becomes weaker through repetition. The show is strongest when exaggeration clarifies emotion. It is weaker when exaggeration merely announces that we are watching Spartacus. The alternate history premise creates another minor problem. It is liberating because we no longer know exactly where history must take Ashur, but it also removes some of the inevitability that made the original saga so painful. With Spartacus, history itself created tension. You could understand the impossible scale of what these people were fighting against. Here, The timeline has already been written. That means the writers have more freedom, but freedom creates responsibility. The new path has to feel inevitable on its own terms. The audience cannot rely on history to give events weight. The character logic must do it. Most of the time it does. Occasionally, a reversal feels valuable because it is surprising before it feels completely earned by everything leading toward it. Those moments are not fatal. They simply remind you that alternate history is easiest to begin with the question and hardest to sustain with consequences. There is also a structural tension around Ashur himself. Making him the protagonist is the show's boldest decision. It is also the source of its emotional limitation. Ashur is compelling. He is rarely comforting. That is not a criticism of Tarabay's performance. It is built into the character. But spending an entire season around someone who instinctively turns relationships into leverage can create emotional distance. The series therefore relies heavily on the people around him to supply forms of loyalty, vulnerability, affection, and principle that Ashur struggles to express directly. When those supporting relationships are developed properly, his emotional distance becomes fascinating. When they are rushed, the center of the series can be colder than intended. And finally, there are moments when House of Ashur confuses escalation with importance. A larger threat does not automatically produce stronger drama. A more powerful Roman does not automatically create a more interesting conflict. Another spectacular confrontation does not automatically matter more because the physical scale has increased. Some of the show's most effective moments are smaller, a person realizing they have been underestimated, Ashur discovering that his authority stops at a particular social boundary, someone refusing to give him the recognition he believes he has earned, a fighter understanding that being valuable is not the same thing as being free. Those are the moments where the series cuts deepest. I would have liked even more confidence in them, because that is ultimately why these flaws remain frustrating rather than disastrous. The show already possesses the material it needs. It does not need to become bigger. It needs to trust its strongest contradictions longer. My 8.2 out of 10 reflects exactly that balance. There is too much invention, energy, performance, and thematic intelligence here for me to dismiss its weaknesses as fundamental failures. But there is also enough inconsistency that I cannot pretend the return is flawless. Sometimes the house feels brilliantly redesigned. Sometimes you can still see where the old pieces were put back into place. And the best way to understand that balance is to place this series beside a few other stories that use gladiators, Roman power, historical reinvention, and morally unstable protagonists very differently. Put House of Ashur beside Gladiator, Rome, the original Spartacus, and Black Sails, and you can see exactly what makes this series unusual. Start with Gladiator. Both stories understand that the arena is not merely a place where people fight, it is a machine for manufacturing reputation. In Gladiator, Maximus enters that machine from below. His ability to command attention gradually gives a supposedly powerless man influence that reaches beyond the sand. The crowd becomes something Rome cannot completely control. House of Ashur looks at essentially the same mechanism from the owner's side. Ashur does not enter the arena seeking freedom. He needs to manufacture somebody capable of commanding the arena because public attention can strengthen his own position. That difference changes the emotional equation. Maximus becomes dangerous because people begin loving someone the political establishment would rather erase. Ashur actively wants that kind of popularity inside his house because he believes he can convert it into social capital. So if Gladiator asks what happens when spectacle accidentally creates political power, House of Ashur asks what happens when someone deliberately tries to engineer that process. And Achillia complicates it further. The more memorable she becomes, the less easy it is to think of her merely as Ashur's creation. That is where the series finds territory gladiators not explored in quite the same way. The owner may control access to the stage. He cannot completely control what happens once the crowd chooses its star. Now compare it with HBO's Rome. Rome is more restrained. Its political world often feels dirty, practical, intimate, and frighteningly human. Major historical shifts can begin with somebody standing in a modest room making what appears to be a private decision. House of Ashur is almost the stylistic opposite. It enlarges everything. Language becomes theatrical. Violence becomes visual punctuation. Desire becomes strategy. Status becomes architecture. But underneath those stylistic differences, both series understand one crucial truth about Roman politics. There is almost no clean separation between the personal and the political. Marriage can be strategy, friendship can become leverage, entertainment can purchase influence, a private humiliation can produce a public consequence. The difference is that Rome frequently makes power feel mundane, while House of Ashur makes power feel operatic. If you prefer historical drama that hides its machinery inside naturalistic behavior, Rome is the stronger choice. If you want political calculation delivered with visual aggression and theatrical energy, House of Ashur offers something Rome deliberately does not. Then there is the comparison the series can never escape. The original Spartacus. And this is where House of Ashur both succeeds and loses. The original story had a cleaner emotional engine, freedom. Whatever political complications appeared, that central desire gave the saga enormous force. The gladiators were not simply trying to improve their position within the machine. Eventually, they were fighting the machine itself. House of Ashur deliberately removes that moral clarity. Its central figure has acquired power precisely because he has become useful to the system. That makes the new series less emotionally pure but more morally unstable, and I mean that as a compliment. You can celebrate a clever Ashur move while simultaneously recognizing that the move strengthens a hierarchy you would never defend. That friction is something the original series could create with secondary characters. Here, it becomes the center. But the original Spartacus still has an advantage that House of Ashur cannot completely reproduce. Its relationships accumulated enormous emotional history. Brotherhood, betrayal, grief, loyalty, love, and rebellion gradually fused into one trajectory. House of Ashur has to establish an entirely new emotional network while also carrying the weight of an old franchise. That is why some of its supporting relationships can feel thinner by comparison. The fourth comparison may seem less obvious. Black Sails. Different century, different setting, different visual language, but structurally there is a fascinating connection. Both series are interested in people trying to create freedom or influence inside economic systems that constantly turn human beings into resources. And both understand that charisma is a form of power only while other people continue believing in it. The strongest characters in Black Sails rarely survive through strength alone. They survive because they can persuade people that their version of the future is worth following. Ashur operates similarly, except his vision is far more personal. He is not attempting to create a new world. He wants a better position in the existing one. The difference tells you almost everything about him. If you loved House of Ashur because of the Roman setting, an arena spectacle, watch or revisit Gladiator. If the political manipulation was your favorite part, Rome is the obvious next stop. If what you really want is the emotional rebellion and brotherhood underneath this franchise, return to the original Spartacus saga. And if the morally complicated alliances, shifting loyalties, and constant negotiation of power are what hooked you, Black Sails may be the most rewarding recommendation of the group. But if House of Ashur did not work for you because its heightened language, visual excess, and deliberately theatrical violence felt too artificial, then do not simply look for another gladiator story. Watch Rome instead. It handles many of the same subjects: class ambition, political fragility, social hierarchy, and the machinery of empire with far more restraint. That contrast reveals what House of Ashur is actually offering. It is not the most realistic Roman drama. It is not the cleanest heroic story. It is not even trying to replace Spartacus. Its advantage is stranger. It takes the machinery that once produced a rebellion and asks what happens when one of the people damaged by that machinery becomes its operator. That is why comparing it only to other arena stories misses the point. The gladiators are the spectacle. The real subject is power changing hands without the system itself disappearing. And that leads directly to the world into which House of Ashur arrived. Because bringing back this particular kind of deliberately excessive television in 2025 meant confronting an entertainment culture very different from the one that first made Spartacus a phenomenon. And House of Ashur returned to television at a fascinating moment because in 2025, simply reviving an old franchise was no longer enough to make that revival feel special. By then, audiences had spent years watching studios reopen familiar worlds, resurrect old characters, build prequels, produce legacy sequels, and search established intellectual property for another story. So House of Ashur arrived with an immediate burden. It had to answer the question every revival faces: why this? Why now? And perhaps most dangerously, why Ashur? The critical response suggests that for many professional reviewers, the series found a convincing answer. Rotten Tomatoes currently records a 91% critic score from 11 reviews, while Metacritic gives the season a 75 based on 9 critic reviews, placing it in the generally favorable range. Critics repeatedly highlighted something we have already been following through this box. Beneath the deliberately excessive surface, there was stronger character and story construction than the premise might initially suggest. But the audience reaction was much more fractured. Rotten Tomatoes shows a 64% audience score from more than 500 ratings, while Metacritic's series level user score sits at 4.8 out of 10 from 124 ratings. That gap is revealing. Some people embraced the return precisely because it refused to behave like a respectful museum piece. Others compared every choice to the original series and found a new ensemble, older timeline, and especially the prominence of Achillia difficult to accept. And some online criticism became entangled with arguments about representation rather than simply filmmaking. That makes the response to Achillia particularly interesting, because inside the story she is being judged before she can prove herself. Outside the story, something similar happened. The character became a point of debate before many conversations had moved very far into what Tanika Davis was actually doing with the role. Then the industry recognition pushed in another direction. The Critics' Choice Association selected Davis for its 2025 Breakthrough Performance Award for House of Ashur, specifically recognizing her work as Achillia. That award feels deserved to me because Davis had the hardest assignment among the new cast. She had to make Achillia feel like a person rather than an announcement. This series could easily have treated female gladiator as the entire character. Her performance gives the idea weight. She brings physical determination, vulnerability, anger, intelligence, and enough uncertainty that Achillia's ascent feels fought for rather than automatically granted. The series also earned a 2026 Saturn Award nomination for Best New Genre Series. If anything feels overlooked, I would point to a Nick E. Tarabay. Not because the performance required the loudest transformation, but because it required something subtler. He had to take a character audiences already understood in one function and prove that Ashur could carry the center of an entire story without becoming a different man. That is difficult work. What makes the show's cultural position even stranger is what happened after the season ended. The 10-episode run concluded in February 2026. On May 20, 2026, Stars cancelled the series after one season. Although Lionsgate Television was reported to be shopping it elsewhere, Stephen S. DeKnight had already written a second season. That changes how the first season feels now. At release, House of Ashur looked like the reopening of a franchise. Today, it may instead be a single alternate history experiment, and strangely, that could help its reputation over time. Cause television often develops differently from mainstream hits. A series that is too stylized, violent, theatrical, or specific for universal approval can become more interesting once the pressure of weekly comparison disappears. People discover it later knowing exactly what kind of show it is. They stop asking whether it will become the old Spartacus. They can judge the thing that actually exists. So does House of Ashur feel timeless? Not completely. Its existence is unmistakably connected to the modern era of franchise revival and alternate continuity storytelling. But its central question is much older than television. What happens when someone excluded by power finally obtains some? Does suffering create empathy? Can it simply teach someone how their system works? That question belongs to Rome. It belongs to 2025. And it belongs to almost every society that has ever confused rising within a hierarchy with escaping it. Which is why the debates surrounding House of Ashur lead naturally into another compartment. Because once a story deliberately breaks its own history, audiences immediately begin asking what else that broken timeline might permit. And the moment House of Ashur tells you that history itself can be rewritten, every familiar name becomes suspicious. Because once Ashur survives the point where the original story killed him, there is no reason to assume that only his life changes. That became the foundation of one of the strongest theories discussed by fans while the season was airing. Ashur's survival is not merely one alternate event. It is the first domino in a timeline that could eventually become almost unrecognizable. Some fans pushed that idea to its extreme, theorizing that Ashur might ultimately interfere directly with Caesar's historical trajectory and effectively occupy narrative territory history originally reserved for much greater Roman figures. One pre-finale discussion even imagined Ashur killing Caesar and then continuing upward through a radically altered Rome. Whether that exact tradition survives scrutiny is less interesting right now than the logic behind it, because the show itself encourages the question. If Ashur was supposed to die, and he did not, then every person he meets afterward is now encountering someone who should not exist. That means every decision Ashur influences potentially creates another divergence. One changed relationship, one interrupted marriage, one gladiator given an opportunity that never existed, one political alliance that develops differently. Alternate history works best when it treats those changes as consequences rather than decorations. So I think the strongest version of this theory is not that Ashur secretly replaces one specific historical figure. It is that Ashur becomes an infection in the historical timeline. The longer he survives, the less useful our knowledge of Roman history becomes as a map. That theory absolutely holds up. The mechanism is built directly into the premise. A second debate surrounds Vidya. Some fans question whether her attraction to Ashur reflected genuine affection, fascination with what he represents, or simply rebellion against the narrow Roman life available to her. Others interpreted her interest in Achillia and Ashur's house as part of a wider awakening of fascination with seeing people challenge roles society has already assigned them. That interpretation is much more interesting than reducing the relationship to a simple question of whether she loves him. Because Ashur can represent freedom to Virya without actually being free himself. Think about the contradiction. From her perspective, he can appear self-made. He was once beneath Roman elites. Now he owns property, commands fighters, disrupts expectations, and introduces Achillia into an arena that supposedly has no place for her. From Ashur's perspective, however, almost everything he possesses still depends upon Roman approval. So Viridia can look at Ashur and see rebellion, while we look at him and see accommodation. Both interpretations can exist simultaneously. That makes her attraction to his world psychologically richer than a conventional romance. She may be drawn not only to Ashur the man, but to what she imagines Ashur proves is possible. And that difference matters. Because people sometimes fall in love with the freedom somebody appears to represent before discovering the compromises that freedom required. Then we reach the most contentious interpretation surrounding the series. Is Achillia evidence that Ashur is becoming a better man? Some viewers read his willingness to give her an opportunity as evidence of genuine evolution. Others strongly rejected that reading, arguing that Ashur still profits from a system built on ownership and that giving one extraordinary person an opportunity does not erase either that system or his own past. That debate appeared repeatedly in fan discussions, especially as viewers compared this Ashur with the morally uglier actions associated with his original series history. For me, the second interpretation holds up better, at least initially. Ashur recognizing Achillia's ability does not automatically make him enlightened, it makes him perceptive. There is a difference. He sees something other people dismiss. That is admirable only up to a point. He also sees what her uniqueness can do for his house. That is classic Ashur. Opportunity and exploitation can occupy the same decision, and I think the series becomes weaker if we insist on choosing only one. The more interesting possibility is that Ashur begins with self-interest and then discovers that responsibility toward another human being is harder to contain than commercial calculation. That would be genuine development, not pretending his past never happened, not transforming him overnight into Spartacus, but forcing him to experience the difference between recognizing somebody's value and respecting somebody's humanity. Achillia generated her own set of theories before and during the season. Even before the premiere, fans speculated that she would rapidly become champion of the house, while others pushed back that promotional material did not establish such an outcome and that the character would need to earn her progression. As episodes arrived, that discussion changed. Some viewers who had worried she would become unbeatable too quickly noted that the series repeatedly allowed her to struggle, lose ground, and learn rather than simply presenting immediate dominance. And that debate accidentally reveals something useful about the character. Her real function is not proving that she is physically superior to every man around her. That would be dramatically boring. Her function is exposing how quickly people alter the standards of legitimacy when someone unexpected begins satisfying them. If she loses, some characters can say she never belonged. If she wins, those same people can search for another reason the victory should not count. That is why her journey connects so neatly with Ashur's. Both characters can achieve the things supposedly required of them and still discover that acceptance has moved further away, which gives us the final theory worth carrying forward. Maybe the house of Ashur is not really being built around Ashur at all. Maybe Ashur is simply the first owner of something that will eventually develop beyond his control. A house gains identity through the people inside it. A champion can become more famous than a Lannister. A loyal servant can develop an independent purpose. A trainer can command respect an owner cannot purchase. A political alliance can transform the value of the entire institution. Ashur believes he is constructing his legacy. But the series repeatedly shows other people supplying the substance of that legacy. That interpretation fits the evidence better than any secret survivor theory or hidden return prediction, because it connects directly to our clue. Ashur owns the house legally, but ownership is increasingly becoming the least interesting thing about it. The deeper question is whether anything meaningful can ever truly belong to one person once other people have sacrificed enough to create it. And that takes us beneath fan predictions and alternate timelines toward the idea buried at the center of the entire season. What does Ashur actually think freedom looks like? And the answer may be the most uncomfortable idea in the entire series. Ashur thinks freedom looks like becoming the person who gives the orders. That sounds almost reasonable when you remember where he came from. If you have spent your life beneath someone else, power can easily begin to look like the opposite of suffering. If someone controlled where you slept, where you fought, what your body was worth, and whether your voice mattered, then owning the room must feel like freedom. Having servants must feel like freedom. Giving commands must feel like freedom. Being invited into spaces that once excluded you must feel like freedom. But House of Ashur keeps placing one quiet contradiction underneath all of that. Ashur changes position, the system remains. That is the deeper layer. This is a story about the difference between escaping oppression and succeeding within its rules. Those two things can look identical from a distance. They are not. Ashur has learned Rome extraordinarily well. He understands that people are assigned value according to usefulness. He understands that spectacle creates attention. He understands that attention can be converted into influence. He understands that friendship can become leverage and that weakness is dangerous when somebody else knows how to exploit it. These lessons helped him survive, but survival lessons can become moral traps. If a brutal environment teaches you that everyone must either control or be controlled, then finally becoming powerful may not liberate you from that worldview. It may complete it. That is why the Ludus is such a perfect symbol. We began with the house as our clue. Now look at what a house actually represents. Its walls have not changed their meaning simply because Ashur's name sits above them. People still train for somebody else's profit. Bodies still become investments. Victory still determines value. Failure still carries consequences decided by people with greater authority. The owner changes, the mechanism continues, and there is something painfully human in that. You do not need to live in ancient Rome to recognize it. People sometimes spend years dreaming about reaching a position that hurt them when they were below it. The employee who hated being ignored becomes the manager who stops listening. The outsider who wanted access reaches the inner circle and begins guarding the same door. Someone who suffered under arbitrary rules finally gains authority and discovers that enforcing those rules can feel strangely satisfying. Not because suffering automatically makes people cruel. It does not, but pain does not automatically teach the correct lesson either. Sometimes it teaches empathy, sometimes it teaches fear, sometimes it teaches a person never to be vulnerable again. Ashur's life has taught him that vulnerability is expensive. So he collects control. That is why his hunger for legitimacy matters more than simple greed. Money can buy comfort. Legitimacy promises something deeper. It promises that the people who once dismissed him will have to admit they were wrong. And that desire is dangerous because there is no obvious finish line. How much recognition would be enough? One victory, one respected house, one alliance, one Roman invitation, one person of greater status finally speaking to him as an equal. Every time Ashur moves upward, another level appears. Rome is built like that. There is always someone above the balcony you thought was the top. And the series translates that hierarchy into something emotional. Ashur does not merely want power, he wants proof that the humiliation of his past no longer defines him. But external status cannot completely provide that proof. The past remains inside him. That is why disrespect carries so much weight. A small insult can reopen an enormous wound because it suggests that underneath the title, property, and authority, Rome still sees the same man. Achillia reveals another side of this thing. She enters a system that has already decided what she is allowed to be. Her challenge is not only physical, it is interpretive. People see her and construct a limit before she acts. So every success becomes an argument over who gets to define identity. Ashur relates to that struggle because he has lived his own version of it. But the series creates tension by showing that shared experience does not automatically create shared morality. You can recognize your own wound in another person and still use them. That is one of the show's sharpest ideas. Understanding someone is not the same thing as respecting their freedom. And value is not the same thing as humanity. Rome is very good at confusing those ideas. A gladiator can become incredibly valuable while remaining unfree. A person can become famous while still being controlled. A house can gain prestige because of someone's talent without giving that person ownership of what their talent created. That contradiction reaches beyond the arena. We live in cultures that constantly measure people. Income, status, popularity, followers, titles, productivity, physical appearance, achievement, and those measurements can slowly become substitutes for worth. House of Ashur exacts mechanism through Rome, but the emotional pattern is familiar. If everyone around you values what you produce, it becomes frighteningly easy to wonder who you are when you stop producing it. That is why the crowd matters so much. The crowd seems powerful because it can create a star. But its love is conditional. Perform, win, surprise us, entertain us. Then we will say your name. The moment performance becomes the price of recognition, admiration begins resembling another form of ownership. And Ashur participates in that economy while simultaneously suffering from another version of it. Rome also tells him, perform, be useful, deliver something valuable, do not embarrass us. Then perhaps we will let you remain where you have climbed. That is the connection. Ashur and his gladiators appear to occupy opposite sides of the house, but structurally they are closer than he wants to admit. Someone above him can still define his value. That is why the house becomes almost tragic as a symbol. Ashur thinks owning it proves how far he has traveled. The house keeps proving how much of Rome he has carried with him. And then there is the recurring idea of being watched. The arena makes it literal. But everyone in this war performs. Ashur performs mastery. Roman elites perform superiority. Gladiators perform strength. People inside relationships perform loyalty while calculating risk. Even rebellion can become performance when somebody needs another person to believe they are fearless. The series repeatedly asks what remains when the performance drops. Who is Ashur when nobody is impressed? Who is Achillia when she is not being asked to prove anything? Who are these people when usefulness is removed from the equation? Those questions matter because freedom may begin exactly there. Not when nobody can command you, but when your value no longer depends entirely on satisfying the person watching. That is the idea I keep returning to. Asher believes freedom means finally controlling the box. The series quietly suggests something harder. Maybe freedom begins when you stop accepting the box's definition of what makes you worthy. And that makes the House of Usher more than a location. It becomes an inheritance, a structure handed from one master to another, a set of rules surviving the people who enforce them. A reminder that removing one cruel person does not automatically remove the cruelty built into a system. Which raises the next question. If House of Ashur is deliberately revisiting one of television's most recognizable gladiatorial worlds through that idea, what kind of legacy can this alternate chapter actually leave behind? And this is the point where we have to be careful. House of Ashur is too recent for me to honestly tell you that it has already changed television. There is no reliable trail yet connecting later films or shows directly to its influence. Anyone claiming otherwise would be confusing prediction with evidence. But influence is not the only form of legacy. Sometimes a story changes the possibilities inside its own franchise first, and that is where House of Ashur has already done something significant. The original Spartacus saga reached its conclusion in 2013. More than a decade later, the obvious way to revive it would have been a prequel, another historical figure, or a continuation centered on characters whose survival did not contradict the established story. Instead, Stephen S. DeKnight chose the dangerous option. He reopened the franchise by changing one fact: Ashur leaves. That choice demonstrates that Spartacus no longer has to function only as one fixed historical road. It can become a collection of alternate routes that may ultimately be the series' most important contribution to the franchise. It transforms continuity from a boundary into a creative tool. A reviver no longer has to ask only what happened before or who was still alive afterward. It can ask, what if one decisive event broke differently? That gives this universe access to characters, alliances, rivalries, and outcomes that the original chronology had permanently closed. And critics generally responded far better to that experiment than its strange premise might have suggested. The season currently carries a 75 Metascore from 9 reviews with 7 positive and 2 mixed, while Rotten Tomatoes lists a 91% critic score. Several reviews specifically praise the series for finding sturdy character drama beneath its deliberately outrageous exterior. That matters to its reputation, because when House of Ashur was announced, Ashur survives and receives Batiatus' Ludos could easily sound like fan fiction made official. The finished season forced critics to take the idea more seriously. RogerEbbett.com argued that the spin-off not only honored its predecessor but at times rivaled it, while Collider praised the alternate history mechanism itself as a gamble that worked. That is a meaningful shift. The question moves from why would anyone make this to what else could this format make possible? And I think that is where the legacy becomes more interesting than simple nostalgia. House of Ashur understands that preserving a franchise does not mean fleecing it. It restores the exaggerated language, political manipulation, arena spectacle, visual aggression, and moral brutality that made Spartacus recognizable. But then it changes the perspective. The original series looked upward from the enslaved people trying to destroy the house. This series looks through the eyes of someone who survives long enough to own one. Same architecture, different moral position. That is genuine variation. It also gives the franchise a new type of central character. Ashur proves that a Spartacus story does not require a conventionally heroic protagonist. A manipulator can occupy the center. An antagonist from an earlier story can become the lens to which a new one is examined. The audience can be asked to understand somebody without being asked to forgive everything they have done. That is useful territory for any long-running fictional universe. Achillia leaves another mark. Not because one character instantly changes the Sordens and the genre, but because she expands what this specific television franchise permits itself to place at the center of gladiatorial spectacle. The most successful parts of her story do not ask you to accept her simply because the show says she matters. They make her prove herself inside the dramatic machinery. That is why the character has a chance of lasting beyond the immediate arguments surrounding her. People may first remember the novelty. What matters later is whether they remember the person. But the legacy now contains an uncomfortable complication. The series was cancelled by Starz on May 22, 2026, after its 10-episode first season, although Lionsgate Television was reportedly shopping it to other platforms. That means we cannot talk about House of Ashur as though its long-term future is settled. As of August 2026, there is no confirmed second season, and that cancellation may ultimately become part of the show's identity, a critically well-received experiment, a divided audience response. A story designed to open an alternate timeline that may have received only one season to explore it. Sometimes cancellation shrinks a show's reputation. Sometimes it concentrates it. Years later, people discover a short run and ask why nobody continued it. The current gap between critic and user reception suggests House of Ashur may remain divisive rather than settling into universal agreement. Metacritic currently shows a 4.8 user score despite the much stronger critic average, and perhaps that is appropriate. This was never a safe continuation. It revived the wrong man, changed the correct history, built an important part of its new identity around a gladiator the old series never had. Then asked longtime fans to accept that the Spartacus universe could belong to something other than the story they remembered. Some embraced that, some rejected it, but indifference is harder. And for a franchise returning after more than a decade, provoking a real argument may be more valuable than producing a continuation. Everybody politely forgets. So I would not say House of Ashur has changed cinema or television. Not yet. Its influence is too young to measure honestly, but it has changed what Spartacus itself can be. It has shown that this world can survive without simply rebuilding Spartacus. It can fracture history, change perspective, center morally dangerous people, turn old endings into new questions. And if the House of Usher ultimately remains standing for only one season, that may be its legacy. It proved the box could be reopened without pretending the first story had never ended. Now only one compartment remains before the verdict, and this one cannot be opened without revealing everything. Because once we follow our original clue all the way to the ending, the question of who owns the house receives an answer very different from the one Ashur expected. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Now we can finally answer the question we have carried through every compartment of this box. Who owns the House of Ashur? For most of the season, the obvious answer is Ashur. By the finale, that answer becomes almost meaningless because the decisive chain begins before the final games, when Ashur learns exactly what his climb into Roman politics has cost him. Viria is intended for Pompey. That marriage would strengthen Pompey's political position, creating a problem for the interests represented by Caesar. Caesar therefore gives Ashur an assignment that exposes the truth of their relationship. Gabinius must be removed from the board. Ashur resists. And that hesitation matters. Not because Ashur suddenly becomes morally pure. Because Gabinius finally gives him something he has wanted far longer than money. Recognition. During their final encounter, Gabinius stops treating Ashur merely as the Syrian beneath Roman society and finally acknowledges him personally. He also gives Ashur reason to believe that Viria's feelings for him are genuine. For perhaps a moment, Ashur receives exactly what he thought climbing the hierarchy would eventually provide: respect. And it arrives at the worst possible time, because Caesar has already made Ashur's choice clear: obey or lose the Roman support holding up everything he has built. Ashur tries to avoid the direct path. He participates in a plan involving Pompey, hoping to shift the political situation without simply carrying out Caesar's demand. But the maneuver collapses into tragedy, and Ashur ultimately finds himself forced to kill Gabinius anyway. This is one of the most important turns of the season. Remember what Ashur believed power would give him: choice. Yet the closer he gets to Rome's inner machinery, the fewer meaningful choices he seems to possess. He owns gladiators. Caesar effectively owns the decision. Ashur can resist emotionally. He can negotiate, he can improvise. But when a man with greater political backing decides what must happen, Ashur discovers the ceiling above his supposed freedom. And the person who pays for that lesson is one of the first powerful Romans to finally acknowledge him. That is not accidental. The system makes Ashur destroy the recognition he was chasing. Then it promises him compensation. Caesar's price for Gabinius is enormous. Ashur expects the rebuilt arena and control of Capua's games, the ultimate transformation of spectacle into institutional authority. Think about what that reward means. At the beginning, Ashur owned one ludus and desperately wanted Rome to notice. Now he believes he is about to control the arena itself. He would no longer merely prepare fighters for another man's spectacle. He would become part of the structure deciding how that spectacle operates. The former gladiator would effectively rise from being displayed by the machine to helping manage the machine. That is the dream reaching its logical endpoint. But before Ashur learns whether Rome intends to honor that bargain, the finale gives Achillia her own decisive confrontation. Saladis has already fallen against Proculus' terrifying Scythian champion after Achillia's injury prevented her from taking the match herself. His death reshapes Tarchon, whose anger toward Achillia had poisoned much of their relationship. By the finale, that hostility finally begins turning into cooperation. He helps prepare Achillia for the opponent connected to his father's death. That transformation matters more than the revenge mechanics. Targon finally does what this entire series has struggled to make its characters do. He stops treating another person's success as proof of his own diminished worth. That is growth. And Achillia enters the final contest carrying more than Ashur's reputation. She carries Celadus. She carries her own desire for freedom. She carries everything she has had to prove since entering the Ludus. Then she faces the Scythian. The fight is presented as the culmination of Achillia's Alina story for the season, and she ultimately defeats the fighter who had previously killed Celadus. But notice how different this victory is from her first major success. Earlier, Ashur could look at Achillia and see his brilliant gamble paying off. By this point, she has become too substantial to remain merely his invention. She has relationships independent of him, grief independent of him, plans independent of him, and most importantly, a future she imagines beyond the arena. After the victory, Achillia makes clear that what she ultimately wants is freedom and a return to her homeland. There is the answer Ashur never fully understands. Achillia does not want to own the arena. She wants to leave it. Ashur sees the system and dreams of reaching the highest available seat. Achillia sees the same system and dreams of a life where its seats no longer matter. That contrast is the emotional key to the whole season. Then the final compartment opens. Ashur approaches Caesar expecting payment. He has done what Rome required. He has carried consequences that Rome itself preferred not to carry openly. He has sacrificed Gabinius. He has helped reshape the political board. Now he expects the promised arena. And Caesar tells him essentially that the bargain means nothing. Crassus has decided the money intended for rebuilding the arena will instead serve another purpose. Ashur will not receive the grand reward that justified everything he has done. That moment is bigger than a broken promise. It destroys Ashur's theory of Rome. He believed he understood the transaction. Be useful, receive advancement, accept humiliation when necessary, deliver results, collect reward. That system is ugly, But Ashur can live with ugly systems if he understands the rules. What he cannot tolerate is discovering that the rules apply only when the powerful find them convenient. Caesar does not simply deny him property. He reminds Ashur what Rome still thinks he is: useful, disposable, below. And suddenly every humiliation in the season collapses into one moment. Owning the ludus was not freedom. Roman patronage was not equality. Political usefulness was not respect. The promised arena was never truly his because the people above him never considered Ashur powerful enough to make their promise binding. So Ashur finally does something that breaks the mechanism instead of manipulating it. He attacks Caesar, and in this alternate timeline, Ashur wins. The confrontation ends with Caesar dead at Ashur's hands, producing the season's most radical break from established Roman history. That is the hidden detail behind the entire premise. Ashur surviving Mount Vesuvius was never the biggest historical change, it was simply the first. Remember the clue from the beginning? One man exists where history says he should not. At first that seems contained. Ashur survives. Ashur receives a ludus. Ashur creates another house, but every step expands the disturbance. His survival changes Philydia, changes Achillia, changes political relationships, changes the arena. And finally, Ashur physically removes one of the most historically consequential Romans from a timeline in which Caesar should have had years of history still ahead of him. The alternate timeline has now stopped being a variation, it has become a rupture. And this is why the ending works so well for me, despite all the imperfections I mentioned earlier. Ashur spends the entire season trying to enter history through Rome's front door. Rome keeps telling him that he may enter only as a servant to somebody else's ambition. So in the last moments, he destroys the door, not heroically, not nobly, not because he has discovered Spartacus's belief in freedom. Ashur asks because the bargain has finally insulted him beyond endurance. That distinction is crucial. This is not Ashur becoming Spartacus. Spartacus fought because the system itself was intolerable. Ashur fights because the system refuses to give him the position he believes he earned. Same rebellion-shaped action, completely different soul. And that final image changes the meaning of the house one last time. Ashur began believing ownership would protect him. The season ends by proving that ownership can be revoked. Promises can disappear, and Roman acceptance can vanish the moment usefulness ends. The house never made him flee. It merely gave him enough height to finally see the next master above him. Achillia understands freedom as leaving the arena behind. Ashur still understands freedom as defeating whoever stands above him. That is why their stories move together without becoming the same story. She is trying to escape the box, is still trying to become his owner. And killing Caesar creates the ultimate consequence. Ashur has won the immediate fight. He may also have made survival almost impossible. The man who spent his entire life calculating the safest move finally commits an act so enormous that calculation may no longer save him. That is the irony I love. His greatest moment of apparent freedom is also his most reckless decision. For once, Ashur does not patiently search for leverage. He refuses the humiliation, and history breaks around him. There is no conventional post-credits revelation required after that. The real post-credit question is the timeline itself. If Caesar dies here, what happens to Crassus, Pompey, the Republic, Capua, Ashur? The series leaves those consequences hanging, which became even more frustrating after its cancellation because the finale was clearly opening a much larger alternate history path rather than closing one. But as an ending to the season's central clue, it lands. Who owns the house of Ashur? Ashur owns the walls. Rome owns the hierarchy. The gladiators create its value. The crowd creates its fame. And every person inside it is discovering that possession and freedom are not the same thing. That is what the first image was hiding. A man who should be dead stands in the house that once owned him. At first, that looks like victory. 10 episodes later, we understand the contradiction. Ashur escaped being another man's property. He never escaped a belief that power means somebody must belong beneath somebody else. and until he does, no house he owns can ever make him completely free. So after opening every compartment of Spartacus, House of Ashur, following the house from impossible reward to political trap, and watching Ashur discover that possessing power is not the same thing as being free, my final rating is 8.2 out of 10. And that score feels right because this series takes a premise that could have collapsed into nostalgia and turns it into something genuinely worth examining. Ashur should not be an easy protagonist. The show wisely refuses to make him one. Nick E. Tarabay keeps the intelligence, insecurity, hunger, and dangerous adaptability that made Ashur memorable in the original series, but now those qualities are exposed under a completely different light. When Ashur was surviving underneath stronger men, manipulation looked like a weapon. Once he becomes the man giving orders, the same instinct can look like corruption. That is the reason this continuation works for me. It does not erase who Ashur was to manufacture a new hero. It asks what happens when exactly that man finally gets what he wanted. Tenika Davis as Achillia gives the season another reason to exist. Her journey does not simply expand the arena, it challenges the assumptions behind it. And when her story is placed beside Ashur's, the difference becomes beautifully clear. Ashur wants to rise high enough that nobody can control him. Achillia increasingly wants a life where the hierarchy itself no longer defines her. One wants the highest position inside the box, the other begins dreaming about getting outside it. That contrast gives the season more depth than the blood, politics, and spectacle might initially suggest. Is everything equally strong? No. Some supporting relationships needed more room. A few developments move faster than their emotional consequences deserve. The franchise's heightened dialogue occasionally becomes too conscious of sounding like Spartacus, and the visual excess sometimes pushes past emphasis into repetition. But those weaknesses rarely erase the confidence underneath the production. When this series is working, it knows exactly what kind of entertainment it wants to be. Big, theatrical, dangerous, politically vicious, emotionally messy, and completely uninterested in becoming restrained prestige television simply because television fashions changed while Spartacus was away. So who should watch it? If you already love the original Spartacus, absolutely give this a chance, but do not approach it expecting Spartacus 2.0. That is not the story. Come for the familiar world and stay for the reversal. If you enjoy more complicated protagonists, shifting alliances, Roman political games, stylized action, and stories where almost every relationship contains an exchange of power, there is a lot here for you. And if you enjoy alternate history stories specifically because one changed event can destroy everything you thought you knew about the destination, the final stretch becomes especially rewarding. Who might not connect with it? If you need a protagonist you can straightforwardly admire, Ashur may frustrate you. If the exaggerated dialogue, stylized violence, theatrical visuals, and deliberate artificiality of the original Spartacus never worked for you, House of Ashur would not convert you by becoming more restrained. And if historical accuracy is a primary reason you watch Roman drama, remember that this series deliberately leaves established history behind almost immediately. As for how I would watch it, streaming is exactly where this belongs. This is episodic television built around escalating political complications, shifting loyalties, and cliffhangers. Give it a large screen, good sound, and enough attention to follow who currently holds leverage over whom. If you become attached to this universe, it is absolutely the kind of season worth keeping alongside the original saga. Because House of Ashur ultimately succeeds at something much harder than resurrection, it makes survival consequential. Ashur living is not interesting simply because a familiar face returns. It is interesting because one impossible survival eventually reaches outward far enough to break history itself. The box did not reopen exactly as you remembered it. Someone changed what was inside, and that made opening it worthwhile. Every film is a box, and we opened this one together. Thank you for spending this journey with me here on the Film Box. If you enjoyed opening Spartacus, House of Ashur layer by layer, breaking apart the power games, the arena, Achillia's rise, Ashur's contradictions, and that completely altered ending. Leave a like and subscribe so we can keep going beyond the surface together. And I really want to hear your answer to one question in the comments. By the end of the season, do you believe Ashur was finally moving toward freedom, or had he simply become better at playing the same system that once controlled him? Because depending on your answer, that final confrontation can look like liberation, revenge, or proof that Ashur never truly escaped the house at all. Thanks for watching, and thanks for opening another box with me. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.